Well, still so much to look at. From the ANC's branch nominations list, those figures released yesterday showing over 2,000 branches nominated President Cyril Ramaphosa. Just under 1,000 were nominating Dr Zweli Mkhize for the position of leader. But many other issues to look at with the numbers, including what maybe seems to be perhaps a bigger difference, a growing difference between the ANC and KZN and the party in other provinces. Professor Steven Friedman is a political analyst. He joins us now. Professor, good afternoon to you. If we look through the numbers, we can see really strong support from Mkhize and KZN, and the 8 other provinces, really strong support for Ramaphosa. Is the difference between the ANC and KZN and the ANC in other provinces, is it growing? Is it widening, perhaps?
Good afternoon, Stephen. Look, before I answer that, I think one point needs to be made for the benefit of everybody, and that is that, unfortunately, these numbers are not as helpful in telling us who's going to win and lose than we might have hoped they would be. And the reason for that is that there are still so many branches unaccounted for. There's supposed to be over 4,000 branches who will make nominations. If you look at the numbers we were given yesterday, even in the contest for president, where there are the most nominations recorded, there's still 1,000 branches unaccounted for, and obviously that could swing all the contests away from whoever's the front runner, except for the presidency. I think that, which I can elaborate on, I think that they're very, if you do the numbers, Ramaphosa is going to win. But turning to KwaZulu Natal, yes and no. I mean, if you look at the presidency, yes, that's true. But if you look at the other positions, this idea that KZN is a total outlier doesn't really square up. I mean, Mduseni Ntuli, who's from KZN, is leading the race for Secretary General. Somebody like Mvula Mokonyane for Deputy Secretary General, who would expect, get strong support from KZN, is ahead nationally. So although it's clearly the one province which, still leans away from the president quite substantially, if you look at its votes in the other positions, they're not entirely out of the mainstream.
You make the point about the other branches that you say are missing from this process, so we don't have numbers for them. The other thing that could change everything, of course, is the idea of a nomination from the floor that requires a show of hands by 25% of the delegates in one room. Do you think that's really going to happen, or is that quite a big ask? And I say that because we've seen in ANC conferences, we remember the final hours of the last conference at Nasrec 5 years ago, that tempers can rise. If suddenly 1/4 of people said, we're actually supporting someone who you didn't think we were going to support, what would happen on the floor?
Well, of course, that is a possibility, and I think the reason why people think it's a possibility is that it has happened at a couple of provincial conferences. I think it would be a whole lot more difficult to organize at a national conference, because you'd have to lobby people across 9 provinces rather than just one. I think that there's an outside chance that it might happen in the Treasurer General's position, because if you look at that, I mean, that is the least conclusive at all. First of all, the slight front-runner is Mr. Chalke, who is entirely unknown outside the president's faction. And secondly, there are only 1,200 nominations accounted for there so far. So, the gap for people probably leaning towards the president to nominate somebody who hasn't been on the ballot paper is there. But in the other positions, I find it very unlikely. I mean, thousands of branches have indicated who they want. The idea that they would suddenly change their mind on the Congress floor doesn't strike me as particularly unlikely. Bear in mind also that if you want to nominate from the Congress floor, you have to put your hand up. If you're going to ignore what your branch has told you to do, you can do that in a secret ballot. But once you put up your hand, people know that you've ignored what your branch has asked you to do, and you're going to have a great deal of explaining to do when you get home. So, I think that makes it rather unlikely, except, as I say, in the one position which seems so inconclusive that I wouldn't rule it out.
In a way, we keep hearing, and I mean, in a way, the story of the last 4 years and 10 months has been Ramaphosa under pressure. It reminded me a little bit of really 9 years of Jacob Zuma as president. You know, that was a large part of the reporting at the time. And yet here we have, as you suggest and others have suggested, that most ANC branches want to retain Ramaphosa. What does that tell us? Does that tell us that people who talk about politics for a living, I include myself in that, have just been focusing on the wrong thing? Does it tell us that there's only Ramaphosa? Does it tell us that there's no candidate to take him on just because at the moment?
Well, I'm afraid, Stephen, I think people have been focusing on the wrong thing. And the thing that they often focus on, and I mean, you know, I'm obviously generalizing here, is what they hear from politicians in the corridors. I think it's far more useful very often to look in concrete terms at what's actually happening. Now, you know, it's been claimed, as you correctly say, that Mr. Ramaphosa is under huge pressure. You know, if you have a look at what's been going on in the National Executive Committee over the last year or so, he's won every single vote there. You know, whatever he wants to get through to the NEC has got through, sometimes with a battle, but that's not the point. If you consider that he's entirely in charge of the direction of economic policy, of policy on how to fight corruption. You know, this idea that he's under pressure, I think, is really a myth. So I think the lesson of it is, you know, there are a lot of politicians out there spinning things, and very often they're able to create a reality which doesn't exist. I think it's always more important to look concretely at what decisions are being taken and who's taking those decisions. Also, if you bear in mind, I don't find the fact that Mr. Ramaphosa is hugely ahead particularly surprising, because if you consider that he was being endorsed by Paul Mashatile, who'd been to a certain extent on the fence previously, that he was being endorsed by Mpumalanga, which leant quite in the other direction the last time. If you bear in mind, as you pointed out at the beginning, that the only province to choose somebody else was KZN, then the fact that he's this far ahead really reflects a consensus in the ANC that he's going to get another term.
There's so many numbers to look at, Professor. There's an important note, I think, about someone who doesn't really feature. You know, plenty of people who made a lot of noise before yesterday and don't feature. Someone who didn't really make a lot of noise, but still is an interesting figure, is the current Deputy President of the country, David Mabuza. He held the balance of power at Nasrec 5 years ago, and now seems to be out of the top 6 completely. I realize that the deputy presidency, often in many countries, in many political movements, is a very difficult one to manage. The person who's the president always gives you the difficult jobs. Other people make demands of you, and you actually have no power at all, really. It's still surprising that a man many people believe has had 9 political lives could well be out of the national stage completely.
Stephen, I don't find it surprising at all, because, in fact, the fact that he held the balance of power last time around is what has cost him support this time around. What happened last time around, if you recall, is that he promised that he would support Nkosazana Dlamini Zuma. He came to the conclusion, correctly or quite possibly, that if she was the ANC president, the ANC wouldn't get 50% in the next election. And therefore he advised Mpumalanga delegates to, at least some of them, to support Ramaphosa, and that's why Ramaphosa won. The Zuma faction have never forgiven him for that, because they say, correctly probably, that he cost them the presidency. He's never had a support base in the faction which supports Mr. Ramaphosa. So in a sense, for a long time now, he's been out on a political limb. He's alienated himself from the people who would have supported him, and had to rely on the people who never really wanted to support him in the first place. For what it's worth, I've been assuming for a very long time and telling people who ask me about it that really I think that he has shot his bolt.
And the ANC being under electoral...
The ANC, things are changing to a certain extent, but you still have to have a clear constituency.